Found my grandson hiding in the back of a storage unit off Route 9, 23 miles from the house where I raised his mother. He was 22 years old, sleeping on a folded tarp with a camping lantern and 3 boxes of crackers. When the beam of my flashlight hit his face, he didn't look relieved. He looked like a man who'd been caught doing something terrible. He held up both hands and said, "Please don't tell her where I am." His mother had called me 6 days earlier to say he'd stolen $40,000 from my bakery accounts and disappeared. Something was wrong. A thief doesn't hide in a storage unit eating crackers. A thief runs. My name is Loretta, and this is my story. I was in Tucson when my daughter called. I'd been staying with my sister for 3 weeks, the first real rest I'd taken since my husband passed. Gil had been sick for 2 years before the end. Vascular dementia that came in like fog and never lifted. I'd been his nurse, his companion, his reminder of who he was. When he died in February, I didn't have anything left in me. My sister said, "Come out, sleep, eat food you didn't cook yourself." So I went. I was sitting on her back porch watching the sun go down behind the Rincon Mountains when my phone rang. My daughter's name on the screen. I picked up. She didn't say hello. She said, "Mom, Nathan stole from the bakery." I set my iced tea down. "What?" "He's been transferring money out of the operating account. Small amounts, over and over. Wade found it this morning." Her voice was tight, clipped. She'd been crying, but she'd stopped. "He cleaned out his apartment. He's gone." Wade was her husband. He handled the business side of things since Gil got sick. Payroll, vendor contracts, the bookkeeping my husband used to do himself at the kitchen table after dinner every night for 30 years. "How much?" I asked. $40,000, maybe more." Wade's still going through it. I pressed my hand flat against my thigh. $40,000. That was the flour account, the equipment fund, the money we kept liquid for the farmers' market contracts we renewed every spring. "Nathan wouldn't do that," I said. My daughter's voice went sharp. "Mom, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying it doesn't fit. Wade has the bank statements. The transfers came from his login credentials. He had access because you gave it to him." She paused. "You gave him too much responsibility too fast. I told you that." She had told me that. Twice, in fact. I disagreed both times. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. He's not answering his phone. His roommate said he moved out 2 weeks ago and didn't say where he was going." I sat there with the mountains going pink in the last of the light and tried to make the picture fit together. Nathan was 22. He'd grown up in my kitchen, rolling pie dough on the marble counter, labeling bread bags with a black marker while I told him what each one cost and why. He'd worked summers at the bakery since he was 16. When Gil got sick and I needed help, he'd asked to come on full-time. He'd wanted to learn the business. A boy who wants to learn a business doesn't steal from it and run. "I need to come home," I said. "Mom, you don't have to. I'll book a flight tonight." She went quiet. Then, "Okay," I hung up and sat there for another minute. The mountains had gone purple. Somewhere in the yard, a cactus wren was making noise. I thought about Nathan at 12 years old, standing in my walk-in cooler with a clipboard, counting inventory because he'd asked if he could help. He'd spelled sourdough wrong on every single label, and I hadn't corrected him for 3 days because he was so proud of his handwriting. That boy didn't steal $40,000. But someone had. I booked a flight for the next morning, early enough that I had to leave for the airport at 4 a.m. My sister drove me. She didn't ask questions. She just handed me a thermos of coffee and said, "Call me when you land." I flew home to Albuquerque thinking about 2 things: Nathan's face the last time I'd seen him, which was Thanksgiving, and the way my daughter's husband had said the name Wade. Both times my daughter mentioned him, like he was the authority, like his word closed the matter. I'd known Wade for 9 years. He was competent and organized, and he made my daughter laugh, which was enough for me in the beginning. But since Gil died, something had shifted. He'd taken over more of the bakery operations than I'd agreed to. Small things at first. Changing vendors without telling me, rescheduling a delivery I'd already arranged. When I mentioned it, he apologized and said he was just trying to help. He seemed sincere. I let it go. Now I wasn't sure what I'd let go of. From the airport I went straight to the bakery. It was a Tuesday morning, and my head baker, a woman I'd worked with for 11 years, was already pulling the first loaves. The place smelled the way it always smelled, yeast and butter and something slightly burnt in a way that was comforting rather than worrying. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just breathing it in. My daughter was in the back office with Wade. She stood up when she saw me and hugged me. Over her shoulder, Wade nodded. He looked appropriately concerned. "I'm glad you're home," he said. I sat down. He laid out the bank statements on the desk like he'd been waiting to present them. Transfers in amounts between $800 and $2,000, all routed to an external account. Dates going back 4 months. Nathan's login on every transaction. "The account they went to," I said. "Had you traced it?" Wade nodded. "It's a personal checking account. We don't have the name on it yet, but the bank is cooperating." "What did Nathan say when you confronted him?" A pause. Wade glanced at my daughter. "We didn't confront him directly. We discovered the discrepancy on Thursday, and by Friday morning he was gone." I looked at him. "You found out your employee had stolen $40,000 and you didn't call him in to ask about it." "We were going to. He left before we could." "How did he know you'd found it?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "He must have noticed us reviewing the accounts." I nodded slowly, said nothing. That afternoon I told them I was tired from the flight and needed to rest. My daughter said, of course, "Go to the house, sleep." I drove past the house and kept going. I'd been to Nathan's old apartment once, 2 years ago, to drop off a birthday cake. I didn't know where he'd moved. But I knew one thing about that boy. He'd worked at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings since he was 17, first with me, then on his own managing our booth. He knew every vendor on that circuit. If he needed somewhere to go to ground, somewhere cheap and off the radar, he'd ask someone he trusted from those years. I called a woman named Greta who sold preserves 3 booths down from us every Saturday for the past decade. Greta was 71 and didn't trust technology, but she knew everyone. "Honey," she said when I explained what I was looking for, "I haven't seen that boy in weeks. But you might try the storage place out on Route 9. The one Pete Solis owns. Nathan helped Pete move some equipment there last spring, and Pete said he was good people. If he needed a quiet spot, Pete wouldn't ask too many questions." I thanked her and drove out on Route 9. The storage facility was a long row of orange roll-up doors off a 2-lane road with nothing else around it except a gas station and a horse property. The office was a converted shed with a handwritten "Open" sign in the window. I went in and talked to Pete Solis, a man about my age with a sunburn and a kind face. I told him I was looking for my grandson. I told him I wasn't angry. I told him I just needed to know the truth. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Unit 41. I knocked on the roll-up door and said, "Nathan, it's Grandma. Open the door." There was a long silence. Then the sound of movement inside. The door went up about 2 feet and I crouched down and looked in, and there he was, sitting on a tarp, camping lantern on the concrete beside him, looking like he hadn't slept properly in days. When my flashlight hit his face, he flinched and held up both hands. "Please don't tell her where I am." I pulled the door the rest of the way up and sat down on the concrete next to him. My knees weren't happy about it. I didn't care. "Start talking," I said. He pressed his hands over his face. Then he dropped them. "You're not going to believe me. Try me." He looked at the wall. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I found something in the books. About 4 months ago. Transfers I didn't recognize, going to accounts I'd never seen before. I thought it was a vendor error at first. I went back further and found more, going back almost 2 years. "How much?" He met my eyes. "I've counted about $160,000. Maybe more." I didn't move. "From the bakery accounts." "Yes." "Where was it going?" He reached behind him and pulled out a manila folder, the kind we used at the bakery for vendor contracts. He held it out to me. "I made copies before I left." I opened it. Bank statements, transfer records, account numbers I didn't recognize. And stapled to the inside cover, a printout showing a business registration, a small catering company registered in Wade's name, incorporated 18 months ago. I sat there on the concrete floor of a storage unit in the New Mexico desert, looking at proof that my son-in-law had been stealing from my bakery for almost 2 years. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "I went to him first. I don't know what I thought. I thought maybe there was an explanation. I asked him about the account numbers. He said he'd look into it." He exhaled. 2 days later, he called me into the office and told me he'd found discrepancies that traced back to my login. He said if I ever mentioned those other accounts to anyone, he'd report me to the police. He said no one would believe the new kid over the man who'd been running things while Grandpa was sick. He looked at me. He said you'd already lost so much, that if you found out, it would break you. My chest felt very tight. And the transfers from my login? He must have done them himself. Or he had someone else do it. I don't know. But the dates? 2 of those transfers happened on days I wasn't even in the building. I have my timesheets. He reached back and pulled out more papers. Timesheets with my head baker's initials on them. She'd been co-signing since I went to Tucson per the procedure I'd set up. 2 of the transfer dates had him clocked out before noon. I sat there for a moment. Outside, a truck went by on Route 9. The sound faded. Why didn't you go to the police yourself? I asked. He told me you'd set up his access, that you'd signed off on the vendor accounts. He said it would look like a family operation and that I was the youngest person in it and the easiest to blame. His voice cracked slightly. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have money for a lawyer. I thought if I just got out, if I disappeared, at least I wouldn't be arrested. I looked at this boy I had watched learn to make pie crust. He was terrified. Not guilty. Terrified. There's a difference, and I knew at the moment I saw his face in that storage unit. You have everything in this folder? I asked. Everything I could copy. Do you have the texts he sent you? After he threatened you? He pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward me. The messages were there, clear as anything. We both know what I found. Think carefully about your next move. And lower, I'd hate for your grandmother to lose the business she built on top of everything else she's already lost this year. I read it twice. Then I took a photograph of the screen with my own phone. You're not staying in this storage unit another night, I said. Grandma, you're coming with me. We're going to a hotel. And tomorrow morning I'm calling someone I trust. That someone was a woman named Alice Pryor, a forensic accountant I used 15 years ago when a flour supplier tried to pass off a short shipment as a full one and invoice me for the difference. She was semi-retired now, but I had her number saved under Alice Bakery in my contacts, the way I kept everything organized. I texted her that night from the hotel room. I need a full audit. Suspected embezzlement going back 2 years. Can you help? This is confidential. Not even family. She replied in 11 minutes. Send me the access information. I'll have something for you within a week. Nathan was in the room next to mine. I knocked on the connecting door before I turned off the light. Get some sleep, I said through the door. A pause. Grandma? What? I'm sorry I ran. I just didn't know who I could trust. I stood there with my hand on the door frame. You can always trust me. That's been true since you were 6 years old. It didn't change. He didn't say anything, but I heard him exhale. The next week was the longest of my life. I went back to the house. I had dinner with my daughter and Wade 3 nights in a row. I smiled. I asked about their weekend plans. I listened to Wade talk about a new vendor he was considering, and I said, that sounds like a good call, and I meant none of it. Wade was smooth. He'd always been smooth. He'd always been smooth. He asked how my sister was doing in Tucson. He refilled my water glass without being asked. He had the manner of a man who expected to be trusted, and for 9 years I had trusted him. Because he'd made my daughter happy, and he'd kept the administrative side of the bakery running, while I was drowning in caregiving. But I thought about the texts on Nathan's phone. I'd hate for your grandmother to lose the business she built. He'd used my grief as a weapon against a 22-year-old boy. He'd waited until I was 3 states away and exhausted and raw with loss, and he'd made his move. Alice called me on a Thursday morning while I was walking around the block, pretending to get fresh air. Loretta, she said. This is thorough. Whoever did this was careful, but not careful enough. How much? $172,000. Routed through a catering company, Crestline Event Services, registered in your son-in-law's name 18 months ago. The vendor payments go in as real expenses on your books, but there's no corresponding service history. No events, no contracts, no client records. It's a shell. I stopped walking. Can you document all of it? I already have. I'll email you the report. Loretta, this is strong. This is the kind of thing prosecutors like. I thanked her. I hung up. I stood on the sidewalk in the October morning and looked at the Sandia Mountains going pale gold in the light and thought about Gil teaching Nathan to count change at the register when the boy was 9 years old. Always know where your money is, he'd said. That's the first rule. I went back inside and called my attorney. My attorney was a man named Frank Osborne who'd handled everything for the bakery since we opened. The lease, the LLC, the contracts, the insurance dispute we'd won 8 years ago when a refrigeration unit failed and we lost a week of product. He was 70 himself, mostly retired, but he told me when Gil died that if I ever needed anything I should call him first. He met me at his office that afternoon. I brought the folder Nathan had made, Alice's report, and the photograph of the texts on Nathan's phone. He read everything without speaking. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at me over his glasses. "You have a strong case," he said, "both for criminal fraud and civil recovery." "I want him arrested," I said, "but I want my daughter to understand what he did before that happens. She needs to hear it from me, not from a detective showing up at her door." Frank nodded. "That's the right instinct. How much time do you need?" "One day. I'll contact the DA's office tomorrow morning. We'll have everything ready to move when you give the word." I drove home. My daughter was in the living room with a cup of tea, watching the news. Wade was at the office. He kept late hours on Thursdays, he told me once, because the weekly vendor invoices came in. I sat down across from her. She looked at me. Something in my face warned her. She lowered the remote. "Mom, what's wrong? I need you to listen to me all the way through. Don't say anything until I'm done." She set the tea down. I told her everything. I started with Nathan in the storage unit, and I went through all of it. The folder, the shell company, Alice's report, the texts. I laid the papers out on the coffee table between us, the way Frank had laid them out for me. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, $172,000. Yes. And Nathan didn't. Nathan found it. That's why Wade threatened him. She picked up the photograph of the texts. She read them. She put it down. Her face was very still. "I told him Nathan had to go," she said quietly. "6 months ago. I said we were giving him too much responsibility. I thought—" She stopped. "Wade agreed with me. He said we'd watch him closely. He was the one who suggested giving Nathan access to the operating accounts in the first place." I hadn't known that. She hadn't told me that. "He set him up," she said. "He set him up," I said. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet. The neighbors across the way had a light on in the kitchen. She stood there for a long time. "I believed him," she said. Her voice was flat. "He called me at work. He said he'd found the transfers, said Nathan's name was on all of them. I didn't even ask to see the records. I just believed him." She turned to look at me. "I've been telling everyone Nathan stole from us. I called his mother Mom. I called Aunt Patrice and told her what Nathan had done. We'll fix that." "How do you fix that?" "By making sure the truth comes out louder than the lie did." She sat back down. Her hands were in her lap. "What happens now?" "Tomorrow morning, Frank calls the DA. But tonight I need you to act normal. When Wade comes home, you don't know anything. Can you do that?" She looked at me the way she'd looked at me at 7 years old when she was trying to be brave about something that scared her. Same eyes, same set to her jaw. "Yes," she said. "Wade came home at 8:30. I was in the kitchen making tea. He came in and dropped his keys on the counter and said, 'Something smells good.' My daughter had put leftover soup on the stove. She ladled it out for him without a word. I sat at the table and we talked about nothing, the weather turning cold, a pothole on Lomas Avenue that the city still hadn't fixed. Wade had 2 helpings of soup. He said it was delicious. He rinsed his bowl and put it in the dishwasher and went upstairs to shower. I watched him the whole time, looking for some crack in the surface. There wasn't one. He was very good. My daughter and I sat at the kitchen table after he went up. We didn't speak. We just sat there with our tea, listening to the water run through the pipes above us. In the morning, I picked Nathan up from the hotel and brought him to Frank's office. 2 detectives from the Economic Crimes Unit were already there, a man named Rourke and a woman named Detective Castillo, who had a calm, focused way of listening that made you believe she had heard everything before and was not surprised by any of it. Nathan gave his statement. He laid out every transfer date, every account number, every text message. He'd kept records I didn't even know he had, screenshots, a notebook he'd been writing in since the day he found the first discrepancy. He placed the notebook on the table between them and said, "I wrote it down in real time because I was scared and I didn't know what else to do." Detective Castillo looked at me when he said that. "He did the right thing," she said. It wasn't directed at Nathan. It was directed at me, as if she understood what it meant for an old woman to sit there and watch her grandson prove himself in a room like that. Yes, I said. He did. They made the arrest the next afternoon. Frank had arranged for Wade to come into the bakery for what my daughter told him was an insurance meeting, our annual liability review, something routine that happened every fall. He came in with his leather portfolio. He sat down at the conference table. Nathan was there. He'd asked to be there, and I'd said yes. Wade saw him and his face changed. Just for a second, a flicker of something cold and calculating before the smoothness came back. "What's this?" he said. I slid Alice's report across the table. "This is $172,000, I said. "Routed through Crestline Event Services, your company." He looked at the report. He looked at my daughter. He looked at Nathan. The smoothness stayed, but the color left his face. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "Loretta, I have managed this business faithfully for 3 years. I did everything Gil would have wanted." "Don't," my daughter said. She said it quietly without raising her voice. "Don't use his name." Wade reached for her hand. She pulled it back. The door opened. Detectives Rourke and Castillo came in. He looked at them. He looked at them. He looked at me. I think he understood in that moment that there was nothing left to calculate. "You set that boy up," I said. "You threatened him when he found what you were doing. You used my grief and my absence and my trust, and you turned them all into weapons." I wasn't angry. I was past angry. Gil trained himself for 30 years to build something honest. You took that and you stole from it, and then you made a 22-year-old kid sleep in a storage unit eating crackers because you told him no one would believe him. Wade didn't say anything. Nathan was looking at the table. Detective Rourke moved forward. They took him out through the side entrance, past the reach-in coolers full of Tamara's pastry dough, past the framed photograph of Gil and me on opening day in 1987, past the chalkboard menu my granddaughter had drawn last summer as a birthday project. The door closed behind them. My daughter sat very still for a long time. Then she said, "I have to call his mother. Nathan's mother. I have to tell her what I said and take it back." "Yes," I said. "And Aunt Patrice, yes." She looked at Nathan across the table. He was still looking down. She stood up and walked around the table and sat in the chair next to him. He didn't look up. "I'm sorry," she said. "I said things about you that weren't true, and I should have asked questions before I believed any of it. I'm sorry." He nodded. He still didn't look up. Then he said, "You didn't know. I should have asked." He looked up. His eyes were red. He was convincing. "That's not an excuse." He thought about that. Then he said, "No, but it's something." My daughter put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand over and let her. I stood up and walked out to the bakery floor, where the ovens were still warm and the smell of the day's bread was still in the air. I stood there by the front counter and looked at the space I'd been standing in for 37 years. The flour bins along the wall, the old display case with the crack in one corner of the glass that I kept meaning to replace, the chalkboard with the specials. Gil had built the shelving behind the counter himself, on a weekend in October the year we opened. He'd measured wrong twice and had to go back to the hardware store. He'd been furious with himself. I brought him a cup of coffee and sat on an overturned bucket and watched him measure a third time. When it finally went in straight, he'd turned around and said, "Loretta, we're really doing this." Like he couldn't quite believe it. We really were. The divorce was finalized 14 months later. The criminal case took longer. Wade pled out rather than go to trial, which meant a conviction and restitution, though the money came back in pieces over years and probably never would come back entirely. My attorney said that was normal. I said I could live with it. What I couldn't have lived with was not knowing the truth. Nathan came back to the bakery 6 months after Wade left. He didn't ask. I called him and said I needed someone who understood the books and knew where everything was. He showed up the next morning at 6 a.m. with his old notebook and his timesheets and the careful look he always had when he was trying to understand something. He's my operations manager now. He's 25, which is young for the title. But he's been training for it since he was 9 years old, counting inventory on a clipboard. My daughter is better. Not all the way. I don't think you get all the way back from something like that in a year or two. But she started asking questions. She calls me now when something doesn't feel right, instead of waiting until it's already gone wrong. That's not nothing. For her, that's enormous. 2 years after all of it, I'm sitting at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning the way I've always done. Coffee going, the sky outside just starting to go from black to blue. On the table is a folder of contracts for the spring farmers market season. Nathan went through them yesterday and flagged two that he wanted me to look at before we sign. He left a sticky note on each one in his own handwriting. Question on this clause and check the delivery terms. Gil used to do the same thing. Different handwriting, same instinct. I pull the first contract toward me. On the wall above the table is a photograph from our opening day in 1987. Gil squinting into the sun, me beside him with flour on my apron, the sign above the door that reads Kowalski's Bakery in the hand-painted letters my mother-in-law did for us. We'd argued about the font for 3 weeks. I look at it for a moment. Then I open the contract and start to read. I still have the folder Nathan gave me in that storage unit, the one with all the transfer records and the account numbers and the printout of the catering company registered in Wade's name. I keep it in the filing cabinet in my office, behind the tab labeled 2022 Resolved. I don't look at it often, but I know it's there. Some things you keep, not because you need to remember them, but because they remind you that you found out. That you didn't let it stay buried. That when something didn't fit, you went looking instead of looking away. Gil always said the first rule was knowing where your money is. I think the second rule is knowing where your people are. I know both now. That's enough. I keep thinking about the moment Nathan held up both hands when my flashlight hit his face. Not the hands of someone caught doing something wrong. The hands of someone who had been running from something wrong that had been done to him. I didn't know that yet when I saw it, but I felt it. There's a difference between guilt and fear, and after 67 years of watching people, I know which one looks like what. What Wade did wasn't just that. He stole money, yes, $172,000, which is a number large enough to ruin a business my husband and I spent 30 years building. But the theft I find harder to sit with is the other kind. He looked at a 22-year-old boy who had done the right thing, who had found the truth and tried to bring it forward, and he used that boy's decency against him. He calculated that Nathan's honesty made him vulnerable. He was right, and he used it anyway. That's a different order of wrong. I've thought about why Nathan didn't come to me directly. I understand it now in a way I didn't at first. He'd been told, clearly and specifically, that I was grieving and fragile, and that the truth would break me. Wade didn't just threaten Nathan with arrest. He threatened him with the idea that telling the truth would cause me harm. That's a precise and ugly thing to do to someone who loves you. Nathan stayed quiet partly out of fear, but partly out of care for me. He was trying to protect me the same way I was trying to protect him, and we were both kept apart by a man who understood exactly how to use love as a lock. What I know now is that the people who betray you from the inside, the ones with keys to your accounts and chairs at your table, they rely on one thing above everything else. They rely on the assumption that you won't look, that you're too tired, too trusting, too far away. Wade had 3 years of being believed without question. He'd earned that through patience and competence and a very deliberate performance of loyalty. And when I was at my lowest, when Gil was gone and I was empty and 3 states away, he moved. The answer to that isn't suspicion. I don't want to live suspicious of everyone around me. The answer is what Nathan did. He wrote it down. When something didn't fit, he kept a notebook. He saved the screenshots. He didn't know what he was going to do with the evidence, but some instinct told him to hold on to it rather than let it disappear. That instinct, the quiet, stubborn insistence on not letting the truth get buried, is what cracked the whole thing open. Not anger, not confrontation. Just a 22-year-old kid with a notebook and enough grit to keep writing in it even when he was scared. My daughter had to learn to ask questions she hadn't asked before. That was hard for her, and I watched her do it anyway. The night I showed her the papers, she didn't argue with me or defend Wade or look for another explanation. She read what was in front of her and let it mean what it meant. That took something too. It's easier to keep believing the story you've already accepted. Choosing to revise it when the evidence demands it, that's its own kind of strength. Quieter than the dramatic kind, but I think rarer. Gil always said the business would outlast us both if we built it right. I think he meant the accounts and the contracts and the vendor relationships. I understand now he also meant the people. Nathan is 25 and he runs our operations with the same careful attention Gil had at 50. My daughter asks questions now. I am still here, still reading contracts at 5 in the morning, still knowing where my money is and where my people are. That's what we built. That's what held.